Today's lecture is going to be about realism and photography, and we're also going to look at some of the architecture of the time. So let's start out with daguerreotypes. Louis Jacques Mande Daguerre was born in 1787 and was considered Paris's leading set designer. He specialized in trompe-l'oeil, which literally means to deceive the eye. Trompe-l'oeil refers to the illusion that one is seeing an actual subject and not a two-dimensional representation of it. In 1822, he opened his first 350-seat diorama. The diorama consisted of dark circular chamber in which large painted scenes on translucent linen were represented. Each picture was seen through a 2,800 square foot calico window that was painted half opaque. Lighting was in the front of this window, as well as behind it. His diorama was so successful that he later built a 200-seat theater that was capable of moving the audience around to view each diorama pivot device. How did it change the way that people viewed images? I think it changed it quite a bit. So with that kind of exploration, when Joseph Nesby actually discovered that bitumen of Judea was soluble in lavender oil and would harden when exposed to light, his vital discovery was that bitumen loses its solubility after being exposed to light, and this method was not camera-based. But in 1824, he took a piece of pewter with a bitumen of Judea and dissolved it in lavender oil and placed the plate onto his camera obscura and made an extended daylight exposure. This is believed to be the oldest surviving camera-based picture. He wrote to his brother Claude, and this is what we see. It was a picture from literally outside his window. I succeeded in obtaining a point of view from my workroom in Grasse using my camera obscura and my largest stone. The image of the object is represented with a clarity and astonishing fidelity, complete with a myriad of details and with nuances of extreme delicacy. To get the effect, one must look at the stone from an oblique angle, in other words, like from a diagonal. And I must say, my dear friends, this effect is truly magical. What ends up happening is that Nesby and Daguerre begin working together. A breakthrough came in 1834 when Daguerre used mercury to sensitize the plates. Estimate exposure time of 2 to 3 minutes to create this portrait demonstrates the high level of control Daguerre had achieved with his invention. Daguerre kept the experiments secret when his process was publicly announced and only referred to them in his private correspondence. The process was announced to a joint session of the Academic of Sciences, or the Académie des Sciences, and the Académie des Beaux-Arts. He published a manual and arranged for the manufacture and sales of lenses, wooden cameras. He died in 1851, though, in relative obscurity. And so what's interesting here is that we see when the announcement was made that it wasn't just made to the School of Science, but it also was made to the schools of art. So right from the beginning, there was a kind of a confusion as to what photography really was. And they thought of it very much like a science, but then it was visual. So here is a image of like what a daguerreotype would have looked like. A plate of copper lightly coated with silver. After cleaning and polishing the plate, exposure to iodine vapors created a light-sensitive surface that looked like a mirror. The plate, held in a light-proof holder, was then transferred to the camera and exposed to light. The plate was developed over hot mercury until an image appeared to fix the image. To fix the image, the plate was immersed in a solution of sodium thiosulfate or salt and then toned with golden chloride. So daguerreotype cases came in a variety of materials. The most common cases are made of wood, covered with tooled leather or embossed paper. In 1854, thermoplastic union cases noted for elaborate designs also came into use. And so if we look here at the entire outfit that a photographer might have used, There would be the camera obscura, the silver plate, the iodine and bromide boxes, improved mercury cabinet with sliding legs, and there we can see the plate holders, the box clamps, the leveling stand, the flat peculiar dish for washing and hand buffing the plate. And so this was a setup that would be taken all over the world. We see pictures of the pyramids, so this would be dragged out to the pyramids with horse and buggy, and a tent would be set up, and they would take all this material and use it. So it was really quite a task. So let's look at some daguerreotypes. So here we have Carl Ferdinand Stelzner's mother, Albers, the family vegetable woman, from 1845. It is very curious to see that they didn't just take pictures of people, but they did take a lot of pictures of people in their the kinds of things that they did. So like their work environment. This is the Benjamin family group portrait posed around a column. And the photographer lived from 1820 to 1893. This picture was taken sometime between 1845 and 1858. And the other thing is, remember, it takes 2 to 3 minutes for the exposure to happen, sometimes longer. So people were told not to smile, because if they smiled and they couldn't hold the smile and they went back to a normal face, like holding it, plain, like we see here, then there would be blurriness on the face. So people were told to find a relaxed position that they could hold for that 2 to 3 minute time frame. And so it wasn't an instant. It was over a period of time that this photograph would take to develop. So I think that that's really important, because we look at these older images and we see these faces being really plain and simple, and we think, oh, no one was really happy back then. That's not the truth. They were very happy. It was just a matter of the exposure time that took so long. And like I said, lots of different things were taken. This is a monument commemorating the Battle of North Point and Calvert Street and Fayette Street in Baltimore, Maryland. So preserved a thin brass binding that holds the daguerreotype, a brass mat, and a cover glass plate, all held together. Preservers were widely used in the 1850s. Lists of hallmarks used by the plate manufacturers and the approximate years they were produced can be used to date the images, because we don't really know when the images were dated. These lists may be found in reference books such as Reinhardt's The American Daguerreotype. And let's take a look at a few more. Here's the United States Capitol. Again, probably in the late 1840s. Ethan Allen Hitchcock, head and shoulders portrait facing front in military uniform. Portrait from 1851. John Curtis Booth, head and shoulders, 1846 to 1856. Here's an occupational portrait, like we talked about a minute ago, of an unidentified surveyor with his tools. So we see these sort of historical portraits that were painted of people, and that moves into, and those paintings were very common in the United States. And so people that were painters would go from place to place and ask, did you want your painting? And that was like their job. Well, now we have photographers, and we can, photograph the person with their tools to show like what they did in their life. Here's kind of a poorly preserved painting of Washington Irving. Clancy Brown, Sergeant at Arms of the Liberian Senate. Here's a General Post Office from the corner of 7th Street and East Street, Northwest Washington, D.C., circa 1846. Here's an occupational portrait of a tin worker, and there you can see how it's really, decoratively held in the preserver. And so there's this, screen over the image. The frame is all enclosed into a book, and there he is actually working on with his mallet and his tin snips and so on. Here's a portrait, an early portrait of Abraham Lincoln, 3/4 length, seated facing front, sometime between 1846 or 1847. And here's another of circa 1864, Abraham Lincoln, slightly before he was assassinated. This is Andrew Jackson, head and shoulders portrait, nearly in profile, sometime between 1844 and 1845. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about this photographer. Her name was Julia Margaret Cameron. She showed a keen interest in photography for many years, and she took up photography actually quite late in life. She was around the age of 48. Her daughter had given her a camera as a present, and she quickly produced a large body of work capturing the genius, beauty, and innocence of men, women, and children who visited her studio at Freshwater, and created allegorical images inspired by tableaux vivants, theater, 15th century Italian painters, and the work of her creative contemporaries. Her photography career was short but productive. She made around 900 photographs over a 12-year period. Her goal, according to many history of photography books, was to make romantic, allegorical photographs capable of expressing the ideals of who but the pre-Raphaelites, who saw evil in industrialization and wanted to return to the heroes who believed in God, honor, and morality. And here we have an image of Julia. What Cameron does is she turns a coal house in her property into a darkroom. A glass-roofed chicken house becomes her studio, where family members and maids model for her. The Victorian photographer Julia Margaret Cameron assembled photographic albums as invitations to friends and families to join her in her artistic aspirations. The majority of these albums include the Herschel, Overstone, and Watts albums, were presentation albums she gave to powerful and influential people to secure moral and creative support. Of fewer number are the Cameron family albums, which, in contrast to her more public-oriented presentation albums, are poignantly intimate in their familial character. In these unique collections, relatives collaborated in the album's assembly over the course of a decade. In July of 1863, a woman of 48 sends her invalid sister a large album containing mostly blank pages. The gesture is an ancient one. The word alba literally suggests whiteness and clarity and light. Traditionally, an album then is a clean slate. The woman inscribes the first page with a blessing on the New Year's and the old. Her benediction marks a new beginning, a dramatic change that she wants to share. And the woman who created the whole idea of photographic albums is Julia Margaret Cameron. This is 1 year before the history books claim that Cameron began her photographic career. The album is entitled For My Best Beloved Sister Mia. The album stands as a record of the sister's immediate and extended family, Cameron's social and artistic circle, and the surroundings of her home, Dimbola, at Freshwater on the Isle of Wight. But more importantly, it demonstrates how photographs viewed here, either individually or collectively, intertwine reality and illusion, fostering the sister's own mythic conception of family life and its traditions. The images in this album give insight and connections that are artistic and surely as important to the family. So that's, the crux here. So we have these important images of people who made big decisions in history that Cameron photographs, but we also have these intimate family portraits, and then her ways of taking and putting the models together in scenes that were like theater or ancient paintings.
So a real different take on what exactly is photography. So let's take a look at some of Cameron's work.
Cameron made all but one of her niece's portraits, photographing Jackson at the peak of her youthful beauty and just a few years prior to her first marriage in 1867. At the height of her presumed connubial aptitude, to borrow a phrase from the popular poet Coventry Patmore, a close family friend. This portrait of Julia Jackson epitomizes the manner in which her mother and aunt projected their idealized notion onto photographs. We know that all babies aren't beautifully sleeping like that, though, don't we? Cameron depicts her niece against an ambiguous, often darkened backdrop, so that Jackson appears as an icon for admiration, separated from the world and all worldly presences. So it kind of gives her this, like I said, otherworldly feel, almost angelic, if you will. This one is Angel in the House. It's stereotypical idea of an angel, a parallel for divine womanhood. Again, this is another phrase that was coined by her friend Coventry Patmore in his popular poem from 1854 to 1856. In fact, Julia owned a signed copy of the Patmore's work. For a short time, he and his children lived at Mia, Cameron's sister's house, after the death of his first wife. John Ruskin pays homage to this stereotype of feminine behavior in his essay of Queen's Garden, printed in the Sesame and Lilies book of 1865. The Victorian feminine ideal embodied purity and selflessness, strong moral codes, and a religious principle, coupled with willingness to submit to the will of her husband. Woman's realm was the home, viewed as a sanctuary from the harsh public world of capitalist competition. And that's why, if we look at artists like Mary Cassatt, we see her painting primarily women and children. It's an interesting time because artists didn't go into the home. They weren't allowed into the sanctity of the home where women and children were, and where women were raising children. So for Cassatt to paint these images was really unusual. And that's the same thing with Cameron. To have these sorts of images of women and children was really different from anything that had gone on before. The angel in the house provided spiritual resolve as well as domestic comforts for the middle-class male, and that male cherished the maternal role, because the woman would provide him with heirs. In another portrait here, Cameron suggests more directly that heaven and earth coexist in her niece persona, when she scratched a religious scene into the photograph's shadows. Here, Jackson emerges as a Madonna Purissima, removed from the worldly contemplation and earthly possibilities of everyday life. Cameron ignores all the standard form of portrait photography in order to photographically record what she calls the spiritual essence of her sitter. In this spontaneous nature of her work, it's almost like snapshot sort of sensibility, but yet see how it's really out of focus, and she doesn't let it, she doesn't wait the whole exposure time and so on. So it's really interesting. She also can do that too. It's not like she can't photograph in that way. So here's an image of Sir John Herschel. When I have such men before my camera, my whole soul has endeavored to do its duty toward them in recording faithfully the greatness of the inner as well as the features of the outer man. The photograph thus taken has been almost the embodiment of prayer. Julia Margaret Cameron said that about this particular photograph. The Annals of my Glasshouse manuscript, and this is in the Royal Photograph Society in Bath. Here's another of Thomas Carlyle. She writes after he receives it. It is as if it suddenly began to speak, terrifically ugly and woebegone. Yeah. Here's another. She gave her photographs breadth and simplicity. Her compositions, inspired by her friendship with the painter George Frederick Watts, are, for the most part, tableaux vivants, with her family and friends acting out scenes from literature before the camera. These images stand in contrast to her powerful portraits. So that takes us to this next part of the lecture, which is about realism. Once we had photography, painters were saying, okay, now what do we do? You know, we've always been the ones responsible for painting the images for posterity, and now that photographs are here, they don't really need that. So there's a different kind of, and then the other thing is that photographs can be used as a source to paint from, so that they don't have to have people sitting for long periods of time. And so what we see is some really interesting takes on painting in realism in the 19th century. So let's take a look here. In the arts, the accurate and detailed, unembellished depiction of nature or of contemporary life would be the description of realism. Realism rejects imaginative idealization in favor of a close observation of outward appearances. As such, realism, in its broad sense, has compromised many artistic currents in different civilizations. The works of such 17th century painters like Caravaggio and the Dutch genre painters, the Spanish painters, Ribera and Velázquez and Zubran, and the Lenain brothers in France all took on a kind of realist approach. So we're going to look at one of the important realist painters in France, and his name was Gustave Courbet. This is a painting called The Burial at Ornans. And what's interesting about this painting, if we look here, is that we don't know anything about what's going on, other than that there's a funeral. So if we look, we say, well, who's being buried? We don't know who's being buried. So there's no real indication, because we don't really see, none of these figures are anybody that's famous or that we know. Look at the direction of what the people are doing. Some people are looking down, some people are looking up, some people are looking away. The dog is kind of looking over at somebody who might have something that might be delicious in their pocket. I mean, you know, there's no rhyme or reason. So this would be like a moment in time, like a scene that was just sort of picked up. And it was a real scene. It's not an idealized scene. It's not like a posed scene. It's literally, you know, so how could he have painted all of this? Most likely there might have been a photograph involved. We don't know for sure, but there's a possibility. So Gustave Courbet, the painter, started and dominated the French movement toward realism. Art critics and the public were accustomed to pretty pictures that made life look better than it really was. And Courbet was very much in opposition to this. He thought that you needed to truthfully portray ordinary places and ordinary people. Gustave Courbet was born in 1819 on June 10th to a prosperous farming family in Ornans. And so that painting that we just saw of his, The Funeral at Ornans, could very well have been one of his neighbors. He went to Paris. This is one of his paintings, The Stonebreakers. He went to Paris in 1841, supposedly to study law, and soon decided to study painting, and learned by copying the pictures of master artists. In 1844, his self-portrait, Courbet with a black dog, was accepted in the Salon, and the annual public exhibition. In 1848, a political revolution in France foreshadowed a revolution in art, as people in the arts became more and more open to new ideas. And so here we have him in these paintings, and he does several of these stonecutter paintings, are really just images of everyday life, of what people really had to do. So in order to make like rubble or like fill, they had to like chop the stones up. So that was a job that someone actually had. Like, remember we talked about in the daguerreotypes how occupational photographs were common. So here we don't know who these are. The boy is looking away from us. You know, he's holding this big basket of stones that he's trying to juggle and probably carry off in just a minute from there. Here's another of those. An artist friend and socialist, Pierre Proudhon, wrote of the first, the older, and then the younger stonebreaker. His motionless face is heartbreakingly melancholy. His stiff arms rise and they fall with the regularity of a lever. Here, indeed, is the mechanical or mechanic man in the state of ruin, to which our splendid civilization and our incomparable industry have reduced him. This modern servitude devours the generations in their youth. In other words, this is all they do. Here is the proletariat. Here is the proletariat. And so he says that, twice in his description. And the idea that this is what we have to do in order to survive. Courbet's early work was exhibited successfully in 1849. That same year, he visited his family in the countryside and produced one of his greatest paintings, and that was The Stonebreakers. Both were quite unlike the romantic pictures of the day that were common. This particular painting, the artist's studio, and it was refused for an important exhibition. Courbet decided that he didn't need to show his work under the Academy, and instead he displayed his work himself near the exhibition hall. And so here again, we have this sort of moment in time of, probably his actual studio. And it's a real allegory, as is his name. So again, very interesting piece. And then also look at the size, 11 feet by 10¼ inches by 19 feet and 7½ inches. So it gives you an idea of, how large this piece is. I mean, it's bigger than a room. It's gigantic. So he visits Germany in 1856, where he was welcomed by the artistic community. In 1859, he was now the undisputed leader of the new generation of French realists. He painted all varieties of subjects, including portraits, females, nudes, and then, of course, all scenes of nature. His series of seascapes with changing storm clouds wafted overhead. In 1865, he had a great influence on the Impressionist painters. And so here we see, there's one of his stormy seaside paintings. Again, really beautiful. And not small, 3 feet 10 inches, so almost 4 feet by 5 feet 3½ inches. So again, not quite as large as the allegory, but large nonetheless. Here's another, the source. So this idea of the water coming down the stream, from, and here's like maybe an underground stream, artesian well that's sort of bubbling to the surface and coming down, and there's a woman bathing. And note, thing I always think is interesting about these paintings is that women were not traditionally these intensely slender, beings that we think women should be today. It's almost an aberration. This would be a natural, woman's form, body. So Gustave Courbet was politically a socialist. He took part in some revolutionary activities for which he was imprisoned for 6 months in 1871. He was also fined more than he could pay, so he fled to Switzerland, where he died in the town of Tours-la-Pays on December 31st in 1877. Remember also that that Courbet was really involved with sort of that movement that pushed artists to do something different. And we're going to look at another lecture later on in this early part of the course about the Impressionists, and we'll see how Courbet plays into what the Impressionists are doing. But for now, we're going to move on, and we're going to look at, instead of painting reality, we're going to look at other ways of producing images. And we're going to look at chromolithography. So chromolithography, or lithography in general, was first invented in 1796 in Germany, and it came to the United States about 1819. Lithographs were created by drawing an image onto a smooth stone, usually limestone, treated with chemicals, and then printed on paper. Color lithography, different than true chromolithography, took a lithographic drawing done with a black outline and was filled in with colors produced on different stones. During the Civil War, Louis Prang traveled to Europe to study printing methods, and I know you've all heard of Louis Prang because you've all seen the Prang watercolors, which has survived to this day. So Louis Prang was a really important figure in the United States in terms of bringing art to the masses, because he was really interested in how to make imagery in color. So he brings all these ideas back to Boston, where he's located. He then realized how he could make a lithographic print look like an oil painting at much lower cost than paying for an oil painting. Prang detailed this process in a speech that he gave to the Pratt Institute in New York just before the release of the Oriental Ceramic Art exhibit in 1897. He explained, "Lithography, as we understand it today, is the art of printing from a perfectly flat stone on which the pattern is neither raised in relief nor cut in intaglio." So that would mean not etched. The lithographic stone, which is an amorphous limestone, dense in texture without being hard, and has a great affinity for fat. In other words, it's like sort of absorbs it. The drawing on the stone is made with a lithographic crayon that consists of soap, wax, and lamp black. So that's the sort of like tar and the inside of the lamp. The drawing, when finished, undergoes an operation called technically the preparation. And this is a really extreme process, and maybe we'll look at that at another time. It consists in flowing over the face of the stone the gum arabic solution and acidulate with nitric acid. The acid neutralizes the alkali of the soap in the crayon and ink and sets the fat free, and in doing so creates a permanent union of this fat with the stone by forming lime soap, insoluble in water. And so that would be the process. So let's take a look. Here's a couple of his chromolithographies. He says, because of the permanent impression on the stone, lithography then becomes a popular printing method, beginning in the 1820s, surpassing engraving, because many more impressions of an image could be made without damaging the limestone, unlike the engravings. Engravings were often made on copper and steel and would flatten over time because of the pressure that was applied from the printing press. And so it limited how many times you could use the same plate. During the same speech, Prang then explained how a chromolithograph was produced to resemble an original painting. He explains, to make a close reproduction in print, a painting of the object is absolutely required. In copying this collection, we were obliged to make a painting of every object. The process begins with analyzing its color for a color scale. The next step is to cover the painting with a sheet of perfectly transparent gelatin, upon which the outline of the design, as well as the different colors, is to be drawn. This drawing, transferred to a stone by simple pressure and inked up, gives the key plate or outline. The artist then has to draw a separate plate for each color. Impressions have to be taken from that key plate in common black ink on the hard, highly calendared paper. In other words, it's got to be registered perfectly to fit in the same exact spot for each plate. Dusted over with a finely powdered red chalk, which only clings to the ink, and thus they are transferred to as many stones as particular case requires. And so here we have one of his Easter cards that he makes by this method with the many different colors. And now I'd like to go to talk a little bit about Audubon. This is John Audubon. He was born in Santo Domingo in 1785. He was the illegitimate son of a French seafarer. And the reason why we're talking about Audubon is because he ends up using this chromolithographic method in the plates that he makes for his books. And so we want to know a little bit about him and how it kind of, how the work that Prang did then fits into like what we know about the realism of nature that Audubon ends up securing for us. He was a French seafarer. He was the illegitimate son of a French seafarer and plantation owner. His mother was a French chambermaid. Audubon himself spun contradictory yarns about much of his origins, though some thought he might be the Dauphin, heir to the French throne. Biographer John Chancellor tells us flatly that Audubon was only marginally literate, indifferent to truth, vulgar, infatuated with himself as an exotic woodsman, the artist, naturalist. But he adds, if this harsh judgment is true, it is unimportant, because too, like many geniuses, Audubon invented himself as he invented his art. And so there we see a chromolithograph of Audubon. He was in Paris during the French Revolution, a 7-year-old watching beheadings. At 14, his father enrolled him in the French Naval Academy. He had no talent for that. He wanted to draw. Finally, if we can believe the story, he studied art with the revolutionary artist David. Early Audubon drawings show none of David's rigor, so, it's hard to say because, obviously, they are all of birds. He moved to America in 1803 to dodge being drafted into Napoleon's voracious army. From the age of 18 to 41, he sought his fortune. He married the remarkable Lucy Bakewell in 1808. She taught school and studied his erratic life. He worked as a dancing master, itinerant portrait artist, storekeeper, and taxidermist. It was a life marred by debtor's prison and bankruptcy. All the while, Audubon painted birds. Lucy and his birds were the only constants in his life. In other words, he pretty much didn't have anything that centered him. Finally, with the help of Lucy's savings, he took his portfolio to England in 1826. He had by then created the most spectacular and complete set of bird pictures that were ever made. And so, remember, he was also a taxidermist. So I want to kind of go through and show, again, this idea of realism and how Audubon sort of fits into that, and others. So here's a couple of his plates. Just beautiful. And these are from a book, so you can see how they've been torn out at the top. The roseate spoonbill. The little blue heron, 1836. The rock grouse, 1838. The white-headed bald eagle. So, Audubon's son, John Woodhouse Audubon, began publication of the chromolithography edition of the birds in America in 1859. So if you tried to find an original edition of this particular book, it would cost you about $5,000 to $6,000 if it was in good condition. Only one volume was completed, however, before the Civil War, and intervened and the project ended. This is a print of a Rathbone warbler as it appeared in John Woodhouse Audubon's chromolithograph edition. The Rathbone warbler was later identified as an immature yellow warbler, not a new species as Audubon had thought. The manuscript is in Audubon's own hand describing the warbler. One of the most popular bird books of the late 19th century in North America was Studer's popular ornithology book. So here's another artist that goes into this idea of bird illustration. It was illustrated by chromolithographs from drawings by Theodore Jasper. Several editions of this work appeared under varying titles, in some cases with the plates altered, colored differently, or even printed backwards. So that means that some of these plates would have been printed by hand. So what you would see in these books with plates would be like all the type would be on one side, and then there'd be a empty page, and on that empty page would be affixed a print or this plate, and on top of that would be a piece of tracing paper, it would look like, but it was like a gelatinized paper that would protect the color of the plate. And then you could go through the book and pick the paper up and very carefully look at the bird that you'd been reading about. So it was really quite beautiful. Here's another artist, Joseph Wolfe, whose work appeared in Gould's Birds of Great Britain. He was also the artist for one of the two small companion volumes in which chromolithography was used for the first time to reproduce these bird illustrations. These books were intended for popular distribution and were attractively done. But Wolfe was disappointed in the chromolithography plates. He never again allowed his work to be used for anything other than scientific publications after that. So these are sort of like coffee table books, and you can see, kind of the different style. Although he worked largely from bird specimens, John Ceulemans was adept at creating drawings that were anatomically correct as well very attractive. Ceuleman was one of the several known artists who contributed to Lord Thomas Lilford's colored figures of birds in the British Isles from 1885 to 1897. The 7-volume work contained 421 plates representing late 19th century chromolithography, really at its best. And that is where we are going to stop for today. And next time we will pick up architecture and the skyscraper in part 2 of this series.